Two machines faced each other across a Tunisian valley on the 23rd of March 1943, and only one of them was a tank. The German vehicle was a Panzer IV in its long-gunned G model. Roughly 3 inches of steel across the front of the hull, a 75mm gun, 43 calibers long, and a powered turret that could traverse a full circle without moving the vehicle. The American vehicle was a truck. A white half-track with a French field gun designed in 1897 bolted to a pedestal in the cargo bed. Open on top. A 1/4 of an inch of armor at the front and less on the sides, enough to stop rifle fire and nothing beyond that. The gun swung 19 degrees to the left and 21 degrees to the right, and past those limits, the driver had to reposition the whole vehicle. The crews of the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion called it the Purple Heart. Around 50 tanks of the 10th Panzer Division came down the Gabes road that morning. By 9 o'clock they were pulling back east, leaving something close to 30 of their number burning or immobile on the valley floor, and the division did not get through Guettar that day or on any day after it. The battalion that did most of the shooting lost 21 of its 31 guns doing it. 2/3 of its strength in one day. What stopped the attack was not the half-track, and it was not the French 75. It was the ground, a belt of mines laid to shape where the tanks would go, and a way of massing artillery fire that was faster than anything else in Tunisia. 5 weeks earlier, the same American corps had been taken apart. The Kasserine Pass fighting ran from the 14th to the 24th of February 1943, and it was the worst thing that happened to the United States Army in the Mediterranean. By the 17th of March, 2nd Corps had recorded more than 5,000 casualties, close to half of them men taken prisoner. The equipment ledger was worse and easier to read. 183 tanks. Another 104 half-tracks. 208 artillery pieces. 512 jeeps. Almost all of it was lost in that 1 week. The 10th Panzer Division was in the middle of that. It had opened the offensive at Sidi Bouzid on the 14th of February against Combat Command A of the 1st Armored Division, and it was still in the line when the fighting reached the pass itself. The American units at Guettar in March were not meeting a strange enemy. They were meeting the division that had already beaten them. Major General Lloyd Fredendall was relieved of 2nd Corps on the 6th of March. George Patton took the corps. He spent the next fortnight on uniforms, saluting, and march discipline, which is the part of the story that always gets told. The part that mattered more was structural. Kasserine had been fought by American units parceled out in small packets across a wide front. Battalions sat on separate hills with gaps between them that could not be covered by fire, and artillery was tied to whichever local commander happened to own it, so nobody could concentrate anything. Guettar was the same army with the pieces put back together. The town sits in south-central Tunisia at the mouth of a valley, about 50 miles south of Kasserine Pass. The Gabes to Gafsa highway runs east through it, and the valley the highway crosses is flat, open, and overlooked on both sides. To the south stands Jebel Berda. To the north, the ground rises into a long ridge, the Americans called El Keddab, with a dry watercourse, the Keddab Wadi, running along its foot. Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen put the 1st Infantry Division on both shoulders of that valley. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 18th Infantry held Jebel Burda south of the highway. North of the road, along the Keddab Ridge, he placed the 3rd Battalion of the 18th, the 3rd Battalion of the 16th Infantry, and the 26th Infantry Regiment. That line ran south to north. Colonel William Darby's 1st Ranger Battalion held ground on the flank. The tank destroyers went onto the forward slope of El Keddab. That is a deliberate and uncomfortable choice. A forward slope position means the guns can see and shoot into the whole valley, and it also means every German gunner in the valley can see them. Allen accepted that trade. He wanted fire across the highway and across the open ground, and the reverse slope would have given him neither. Then his engineers laid a curving belt of mines. It ran from the salt flat at Chot el Guettar across the highway and along the Keddab Wadi. Its far end lay at the southeastern base of Hill 336. The machine coming at all of this deserves its reputation, and the Panzer IV in the G model earned every part of it. The long 75mm gun it carried was the weapon that changed the North African armor balance in 1942. Firing standard armor-piercing shot, it would defeat about 3.5 inches of vertical plate at 550 yards, and it held useful penetration far past 1,000. The Sherman's short 75mm gun managed about 2 3/4 inches at that same distance. That is 1/3 more penetration from the German gun, and 1/3 is not a rounding error. It meant the Panzer IV could open fire at a range where its own frontal armor was still comfortable, and the Sherman had to close the distance before its shot meant anything. The front of the Panzer IV-G was just over 3 inches of plate. American armor knew this by March. Combat. Command A of the 1st Armored Division was fighting east of Magnassi through the same week, and the Sherman crews there had no illusions about what a long-gunned Panzer IV could do to them at range. Against that, the half-track. The M3 gun motor carriage was 20 feet 5 inches long, weighed about 9 tons, and carried a crew of 5 standing in an open box. Armor ran from 1/4 inch to 5/8. The engine was a 147 horsepower 6-cylinder truck engine, good for about 47 miles per hour on a road and considerably less on desert going, and just over 2,000 of these vehicles were built. The gun was the interesting part. It was the French field gun of 1897, the famous French 75, a weapon that had been obsolete as artillery for 20 years and turned out to be a perfectly serviceable anti-tank gun. Firing armor-piercing capped shot, it would punch through about 3 inches of plate at 1,000 yards. That is marginal against the front of a Panzer IV, and comfortably enough against its sides, which is exactly the shot a gun sighted to fire across a valley tends to get. So the American vehicle could destroy the German vehicle. It could not survive being noticed. Any hit anywhere on that half-track went straight through, and the crew stood above the armor line with heads and shoulders exposed. The first shot was everything. That was doctrine, written down. Accident and shortage had nothing to do with it. The United States Army had decided in 1941 that the answer to massed German armor was massed anti-tank guns, pooled into separate battalions and held back until the enemy's armor committed itself, then rushed to the point of the attack. Colonel Andrew Bruce took over the Tank Destroyer Center, and the field manual for tank destroyer employment was published in June 1942. The motto was "Seek, Strike, Destroy." The concept demanded speed above everything, and speed on a 1941 budget meant the chassis already in production. That chassis was a truck. The half-track had already been to war once before this. Vehicles shipped out in late 1941 fought in the Philippines with 3 battalions of the Provisional Field Artillery Brigade, used mostly for direct fire support and occasionally against tanks. The gun had been proven. The thing carrying it had not, and there was nothing yet in production to replace it with. The 601st went into the El Guettar Valley with 31 of those half-tracks. Lieutenant Colonel Herschel Baker commanded it. The battalion had already fought the 10th Panzer Division once at Kasserine and had lost that fight. Behind them sat something new. The 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion had arrived with the M10. It was a fully tracked vehicle on a Sherman-derived hull, with an 1.5 inch of sloped front plate, a gun shield over 2 inches thick, an open-topped rotating turret, and a 3-inch gun. It had never been in action anywhere. The 23rd of March would be its first day in the war. The 10th Panzer Division assembled in the dark near Jebel Ben Khair during the night of the 22nd. General Major Fritz von Broich had about 6,000 men, close to 50 running tanks, a company of self-propelled tank destroyers, and a battery of assault guns. His orders were to drive northwest along the axis of the Gabes to Gafsa Road, get into the southern flank of the 1st Infantry Division before daylight, and if possible, get behind it. 50 tanks was what a German armored division in Tunisia could put on the road by March, and the number is worth holding against what the establishment was supposed to be. Between the 1st of November 1942 and the 1st of May 1943, Germany shipped 68 Panzer IIIs and 142 Panzer IVs to North Africa as replacement. 16 of the IIIs and 28 of the IVs were lost at sea before they arrived. By the last strength return compiled in the theatre on the 4th of May, the whole German armoured force in Tunisia reported 44 Panzer III, 25 Panzer IVs, and a single Tiger still running. Von Broich was attacking with what a division looks like after 4 months of a supply line that ran across a sea the Allies controlled, and not with a fresh division. At 3 in the morning, the division started moving. The American tank destroyer crews on El Keddab heard tracks around 4. First contact came about 5:30 in darkness, and by 5:20, the men on the forward slope could make out multiple lines of vehicles moving up the valley. The German formation was described afterwards as a hollow square, tanks and self-propelled guns spread out with infantry, in armoured carriers riding between them, and truck-borne infantry following behind. Around 6, the main assault came on. It worked, at first, exactly as it was supposed to. The panzers found the seam between the American forward battalions and pushed through it, and the leading tanks reached ground roughly 6 miles behind the 1st Battalion's positions. On the way, they overran the 32nd Field Artillery Battalion and part of the 5th Field Artillery Battalion. Both were 105mm howitzer units, firing over open sights at the end, and the fighting around the gun positions was at close range and cost the artillerymen heavily. Then the leading tanks came into the mine belt. 8 of them stopped there. The others did what armor always does at an obstacle it did not expect. They bunched up and hunted for a way through, and the way through was the gap the American engineers had left, a gap they had already covered. The 601st started shooting from the forward slope. First Lieutenant John Yowell's platoon of Company B claimed 2 panzers with its opening rounds and 2 more shortly after. One took 7 aimed shots. Sergeant Willie Nesmith knocked out a Mark IV at 800 yards, and then his own half-track was hit and permanently disabled, while Sergeant Adolph Raymond's vehicle took at least 3 direct hits. That was the exchange rate all morning. A half-track would fire, be located, and be hit. A powered turret can bring a gun onto a muzzle flash faster than 5 men can wrestle, a pedestal mount 19 degrees, and faster still than a driver can reverse a truck out of a firing position it has already used. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr. ordered the 899th forward. The M10s came down into the valley and went into action for the first time in the war. Tracks got them to firing positions the half-tracks could not reach. Armor let them absorb a hit that would have finished an M3. By 9 o'clock, the German attack was finished. The 10th Panzer Division pulled back east, leaving hulks scattered from the mine belt to the artillery positions it had overrun 3 hours earlier. Von Breusch came back in the afternoon with a different plan. At about 4:45, after a German airstrike and on the signal of a siren, the second attack went in with the Panzer Grenadiers leading on foot and the surviving armor in support rather than in front. It was the correct correction. Armor had failed against the obstacle and the guns, so the infantry would clear the way for the armor instead. It never got close. The American artillery had spent the whole day registering that valley, and it put massed high explosive onto the advancing infantry from the moment they were identified. The attack lasted about 2 hours before the German infantry pulled back behind the ridge at the eastern end of the valley, and by evening the division was withdrawing toward Gabes. The 601st finished the day with 21 of its 31 half-tracks hit. 8 of those were eventually repaired and returned to service. The United States Army official history counts the battalion's losses slightly differently, as 24 guns lost, of which 2 were recoverable, which is the sort of gap that appears whenever a unit's own after-action count meets a corps-level ledger. The 899th lost 7 M10s on its first day in combat. The German loss figure needs the same honesty. 30 tanks destroyed is an American count. It was made by looking at what was left standing on the valley floor and by adding up unit claims. The wider battle credits around 37 German tanks knocked out or disabled, with the 601st taking credit for most of them. There is no cleanly published 10th Panzer write-off return for the 23rd of March to check that against, and claim counts made from a ridge always run high. The crews also reported 2 tigers among their victims, which is doubtful and should be treated as doubtful. None of the disputed arithmetic touches the outcome. The 10th Panzer Division attacked twice, failed twice, and withdrew. The tank destroyers did not decide the 23rd of March. The valley did, and then the guns behind it. The valley floor at Guettar is flat and open, and the Americans held the high ground on both sides of it. A German tank entering that valley was under observation from the moment it entered and stayed under observation for the entire approach. There was no covered route to the American positions. The ground gave a German commander no way to develop the attack out of sight and arrive somewhere unexpected. The whole battle happened in full view of men with binoculars and radios. The mine belt did not stop the attack. It was never going to. Tanks out of 50 is a delay, not a defeat. What the mine belt did was decide where the attack would go, which is the entire purpose of an obstacle. Armor that meets mines slows down and bunches up. Then it moves toward the gap. Every one of those 3 behaviors is a gift to a gunner. The Americans knew where the gap was because they had left it. That combination, total observation plus a known point where the enemy would concentrate, is worth almost nothing to an army that cannot concentrate its own artillery quickly, and it was worth a great deal to this one. The United States Army had spent the 1930s rebuilding how field artillery is controlled. At the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Major Carlos Brewer reformed the gunnery methods so that fire could be massed faster. His successor, Major Orlando Ward, and the instructors under him built the Fire Direction Center between 1932 and 1934. It was a single place where the computation for several firing batteries was done centrally, instead of at each battery in turn. The graphical firing table arrived at the end of the decade and cut the arithmetic down further. Pair those with a portable radio in the hands of a forward observer, and the result was a procedure other armies in 1943 could not match for speed. The measured figures give the advantage a size. With an accurate map, a single battery could be firing about 5 minutes after a call for fire. A battalion fire direction center could have every one of its batteries firing on the same point in about 10. That is not a claim that other armies could not concentrate artillery. It is a claim about how long it took them to do it, and 10 minutes is the difference between hitting a tank company and hitting the ground. A tank company used to be standing on. The practical difference is worth stating plainly. In most armies of the period, an observer who wanted a lot of shells on one point had to request them up a chain of command. Staff work allocated the batteries. By the time the guns spoke, the target had often moved. In the American system, the observer sent a map reference and a fire request to a fire direction center, and that center could put every battalion within range onto that reference together in minutes. The observer did not need to know which guns would answer. He needed to know where the target was. That is a procedural advantage rather than a technical one. Nothing about it appears on a specification sheet, in a muzzle velocity table, or on an armor diagram. It exists only as an interval of time between an observer speaking into a radio and the ground in front of a panzer company being covered in high explosive. At Guettar, the guns available included the 105mm howitzer battalions of the 1st Infantry Division, the 5th, the 7th, the 32nd and the 33rd Field Artillery, plus core 155mm howitzers behind them. Two of those divisional battalions were overrun in the morning, and the fire kept coming anyway, which tells you the system did not depend on any single battery surviving. No verified round count survives in the published record for the American guns on the 23rd of March. Figures circulate. None of them trace back to an expenditure return, so the honest thing is to leave the total blank. The shape of the fire is documented, and the shape is what mattered. A German commander in that valley faced concentrated fire that arrived quickly, that shifted when he shifted, and that did not require the Americans to have guessed his route in advance. That is what the 601st's 21 wrecked half-tracks bought. They were not there to win a tank battle on their own, and their vehicles were never capable of it. They were there to hold the forward slope, to make the German armor deploy and fight instead of driving through, and to keep the enemy inside the observed ground long enough for the artillery to do the arithmetic. Every minute a half-track survived on that slope was a minute the tanks in front of it were being counted and plotted. Kasserine is the control experiment for all of this, and it is why the comparison is fair rather than flattering. The equipment in February was the same equipment as in March. The half-tracks were the same half-tracks, and the 601st had fought the same German division. What changed in 5 weeks was the arrangement. Positions that could support each other by fire, a divisional artillery held in general support rather than divided among local commanders, an obstacle plan tied to the gun position, and high ground held on both flanks instead of scattered hills with gaps between them. The 10th Panzer Division did nothing wrong on the 23rd of March that it had not done successfully at Kasserine in February. It attacked at night along a road axis, aimed for a flank, and pushed armor through a seam. The method was sound. It had worked before. It failed at Guettar because the defense it hit was a system rather than a line, and a system is a much harder thing to break through than a position. The 601st was re-equipped with M10s later in 1943, and it fought the rest of its war in them. In February 1944, the M3 gun motor carriage was declared limited standard and obsolete that August. That is the ordinary end of the story. The less ordinary part is what happened to the doctrine that put the half-track in that valley. The tank destroyer concept was written for exactly one situation, which was a massed enemy armored attack that could be met by a reserve of anti-tank guns rushed to the point of penetration. Guettar was that situation. It is close to the only time in the war that a battalion of American tank destroyers got the battle its field manual had been written around. For most of the rest of the war, the battalions were parceled out to infantry divisions and used as assault guns, as artillery, and as anything else a divisional commander needed from a vehicle with a gun on it. A better gun does not stop armor. What stops it is an arrangement of three things that have to be present together. Observation over the ground the tanks must cross. an obstacle that decides where they will slow down and concentrate, and indirect fire that can be put onto that concentration faster than the tanks can get out of it. Take away any one of the three, and the other two are not enough. Remove observation, and the artillery is firing at map squares. Remove the obstacle, and the tanks cross the open ground at speed and at their own choosing. Remove the massed fire, and the observation just gives you a good view of an attack succeeding. The 601st had the worst combat vehicle on that valley floor by a wide margin, and the men in it knew it well enough to have named it after a wound decoration. It did not matter, because the vehicle was never the thing doing the work. It was one component in an arrangement, and the arrangement held. 9 hours after the first German tank tracks were heard in the dark, the 10th Panzer Division was moving east, and the Purple Heart boxes that were still running were being counted on the forward slope of El Keddab.